few days ago, I read a story of a woman living in Japan. Her name is Shundo, and she was hospitalized for 20 days following abdominal surgery. And she had no appetite, couldn't get anything down, and she was offered milk and juice, and she knew she needed to eat in order to recuperate, but she just couldn't. Every sip of whatever they handed her just stuck in her throat. And a friend came to visit and saw the bottles of beverages lined up by her bedside and got thirsty and said, "May I have one?" And of course you may have one. I'm not going to drink them. And she helped herself to one and then a second one. And Shunda watched her friend drinking with such relish and thought, this is fascinating. If everything I eat is awful, it must be awful for her too. Right? That's my experience. And as I watch her eat, I'm just not convinced that what she's eating is delicious and would taste good to me. In short, she wrote, I realized I measure other people by the standards of my own experience. If they deviate from it, I am likely to blame them for being mistaken. She went on to say, it is natural that since people lead different lives, they have many ways of seeing things. Each of them thinking the way he or she sees things is absolutely right, measures other people by that standard, and always judges the other party to be mistaken. This is where I fall short of enlightenment, and it also feels the key to understanding the mundane world. How I feel, see things, and think at the present moment depends on my health, my emotional ups and downs, and my limited experience of my own life and community. I thought of that passage as I watched yesterday the reactions to the Supreme Court's decision. The jubilation, the deep gratitude and rejoicing of so many, and the heartbreak and the despair and anxiety of so many others. How can it be, I thought, how can it be that we each feel so strongly and so differently about this? Each of us operating actually from the same place, from the place that life is sacred and that we have a sacred obligation to sustain and support life. How can it be that we have come to see this issue in such different ways? How can it be that something, a verdict, that tastes so awful in one person's mouth tastes so delicious to others? And more importantly, how do we live with one another? How do we share a society and a government when we have such different tastes? Jews, as the previous chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Professor Arnie Eisen, has written, have always cared inordinately about politics. We have had no choice but to care about it, living as a minority among societies not of our own making, of our own rule. But beyond that, beyond the practical why we care about it, what has kept us alive as a people these 2,000 years has been the prophetic demand that justice is ours to pursue, that justice should sit at the top of the Jewish communal agenda. A right social order, he writes, is not one among many things Jews are meant to strive for, but the essential thing. In fact, in his book called Taking Hold of the Torah, what does he call the book of Numbers? What does he subtitle his chapter on the book of Numbers? Politics in the Wilderness. As the Israelites wander through the wilderness, real life crops up over and over again. We're no longer in the fantastical realm of Exodus where miracles await around every corner. No, boredom sets in, and sickness, scarcity, and a group of people traveling through life together, learning to live with all their differences. Learning to live with all their differences. The 12 spies are sent out to scout the land, and 10 of them come back with one kind of a report, and a minority has another. 10 overcome with fear and trepidation, and only two, undaunted, excited even. In other words, there was no consensus. How confusing that must have been. How could they have all gone and seen the same land and come back with such divergent experiences? When Moshe and Aaron hear their reports, they fall on their faces. We are not given a report of what, if anything, they say. And so I'd like to pull for us 3 lessons from the story in this moment of American Jewish life. The first is that the minority matters. Joshua and Caleb are the only ones to enter the promised land after all. The majority report of the 10 is what causes the downfall of that generation. God finally has had it and says, enough. You don't understand what this is about. You will spend your lives wandering the wilderness. You will never make it into the promised land. The only ones who will make it are the 2 of you leading the next generation, because we must go forward undaunted, even as a minority. Even as a minority, the Jewish community, we have our own pluralism as well. Most Jews stand on the pro-choice position, born of a sense of the importance of the freedom of religion granted of the Constitution. It's a religious right, it's a freedom of religious issue, because in Jewish life, in Jewish values, we hold life sacred, as do our Christian counterparts. But the question of when life begins is a question that we answer differently. And so Jewish law treats life as beginning with the onset of labor and the birth of a child. That is when life begins for us. And so Jewish law dictates that it is permitted to terminate a pregnancy before that time, if needed, for the mental or physical health of the pregnant person, which means it becomes a freedom of religion issue. But it does not mean that every Jew has to see it the same way, that it is impossible to be pro-life and Jewish. I do not mean to go that far. I mean to make room for us, for minorities of all sorts, even within our community. That feels like a key message of our Parsha, that the minority matters. And so we as a Jewish minority matter in this country, and our own diversity of opinion within our community should be held as holy as well. Second point I'd like to pull out. Optimism, not fear, right? If we were giving this story a headline, optimism, not fear. This is the main message, that we cannot see the future, that we need to send scouts out so that the people could see into the future, into the land that they were promised. And the way to never get there was to be so anxious that God says, not for you. To be so anxious and full of fear that your own inner stuff never lets you get to where you wanted to go in the first place. The only way to get to the promised land is to be courageous, to be strong, to be optimistic, and full of faith. And so I hope that we can hold that about our country's unfolding as well, even as we tend toward the majority opinion of despair around our country's future. Let us be optimistic, fearful. And finally, the third point, the story is not over. The Torah does not end with the people reaching the promised land, tied up in a bow, story over, now we begin again. No, the Torah ends with an unfinished story, with one generation building a future for the next generation, with a mixed multitude making their way through the wilderness together. And that's where we are in this country, a mixed multitude, full of difference, all of our identity politics, all of our opinions. The story is not over, my friends. And so we will take our place as hopeful, as a powerful minority, as we march into the future, just as our ancestors continue to march through the Midbar on our journey through these Parshayot. I hope that we can hold in our hearts the recognition that life tastes differently for all of us, but that life is sacred for all of us, no matter our opinions. I hope we can pull from this Parsha and from our Torah these values of the minority matters, optimism, not fear, and we're not done yet. May we be blessed to draw strength from the Torah and from one another as powerful, courageous, and optimistic minority in this great nation. Amen.